Today on Ancestors.
There's something that's so at rest in me to be home. I feel very fortunate to place a value on those things that are deep and meditative and where you can belong.
When my grandmother died, I found a trunk full of letters. So, of course, I had to find out who were the people in the letters.
Right.
So basically, my research started once I had those letters in hand.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Today, you'll learn why your search for family history begins in your own home.
We'll be talking with a genealogist who will show you that undiscovered clues to your family history can be found all around you.
But first, let's visit with Shannon Applegate in Oregon's Yoncalla Valley and discover a home where family history has been very well kept indeed.
I had a life as a wanderer as a young woman and child. I didn't have any kind of sense of home. In 1971, I had been living in Indiana with my then husband. And it was time to make a decision, and the decision resulted in a divorce. I had 2 little children. And the only sort of home place, and really it was more of a sort of, what shall I say, a psychic home place that I could think of was I wanted to come to Oregon. Despite the fact that as a child I had mainly visited here, I still did have a sense that in some way or other I was anchored. I could say my people were from the Pacific Northwest. They were from Oregon. That was important. So I decided that the children and I would come here. One of the things that I discovered when I came to Yoncalla to live in the old house was a sense of patterns in the family, and to my amazement found myself a perfect representative of one of those patterns. There have been a series of pairs of family women who have been responsible for and shared the house alone. The pattern started with my great-great-grandmother Melinda Applegate and her sister Betsy. And then came their daughters, Lucy and Irene Applegate. The next generation had Eva and Eva Applegate. And then came, well, Susan and Shannon. When my cousin, Susan Applegate, decided that she would come and share the old place with me, I was alone. I was absolutely thrilled to have some company. We lived at the old place with the spirits of past generations in a certain sense.
It really wasn't until I met Shannon that I became open to seeing the family in a way that I had not been able to before. This house became the repository for the family mementos and treasures, things that bound as surely as glue one generation to another.
I walked into this house, and it was as if the air were so dense with other people's lives and their things, the objects that they'd touched and they'd loved and had meant something. There were layers of living and layers of life in it, and you could see it in all of the rooms. You could see things from 5 or 6 generations. There were, for example, the cupboards that my great-grandfather had built with glass fronts, which had salt cellars that had belonged to his grandparents, and tarnished napkin rings, and chipped teapots. So there were things that were exquisite and truly, you know, antiques, but there were also these sort of homelier objects, baskets with Chinese coins and beads on the top, that when you opened them up, you found, handfuls of marbles, books, photographs, boxes with keys of different shapes and sizes that jangled when you picked them up, tied with a ribbon, but you didn't know where any of those keys went. Just the debris of living. And all on the walls, pictures of individuals in the family sort of looking down. So it was a world, and it truly was boggling. And I remember sitting and feeling my smallness, my size in comparison to this house, which seemed huge and dark and lonely, but also in some other way full and animated and spirited. As the oldest home in Oregon at the present time that's still owned by the same family, this house is unique. But it has another sort of hidden uniqueness. It has 2 sides, a men's side and a women's side. A lot of people have asked, now why did they have a house with 2 separate doors and a wall intervening and no way to get from one side to the other, either upstairs or down? We think we have an idea.
Melinda had had her 16th child prior to the completion of the house. Following that completion of the house with the 2 separate sides, there were no more children born.
This is a house where things might have been separate, but they weren't necessarily equal. And actually, the men's side by several feet is larger than the women's side on the other side of the wall.
Let's go take a look at the women's side. Keep in mind, there was not a doorway here in the early days. There was a narrow staircase on this side of the wall, in the men's side, and an identical narrow staircase on the women's side, right here.
Here on the women's side is one of the most precious of family possessions. Like many early families in America, the family Bible was a critical place for not only inspirational reading, but also for the keeping of records about the family. And the Applegates were certainly no exception to that rule. In this family Bible, which is quite an elaborate Bible. There are flowers that are pressed in the pages and records that have been stuck in over many years about birth dates and death dates and miscellaneous information about family members. And then once these things were recorded, family members used the Bible to actually write down the names, for example, the marriages, as on this page, and then the births and the deaths. In a certain sense, the Bible is a family archive.
As we got to know the women of this family through their writings and through their artwork, through the things that they toiled at and crafted, we got to appreciate their spiritedness, their independence, even though the times prescribed for them a certain docility and domesticity, their individuality shone through.
I've often thought that women are history's custodians. What I mean by that is, women in most families keep the time. And Applegate women, that was certainly true of them. They kept the time. They did that by affixing labels onto things. They'd say these things in their own way on these slips of paper, such as, Great Aunt Irene's notes for the book she was going to write. You know, Sue Applegate Bird's wedding dress. Great Grandmammy's alpaca shawl. When I come into this house, I do have the feeling that time has been kept, and quite consciously. And I don't know what the motivation was for a great-great-grandmother to write so much down. She was a humble, unassuming woman. But somehow there was a sense of life lived being important. I always imagined as a young woman that I would never be able to live more than 2 or 3 years in the same place, because I had become habituated to moving, you know, as a kid. But the truth is, there's something that's so at rest in me to be home. And I've lived here nearly for 25 years now. I feel very fortunate to sort of come at rest and to place a value on those things that are deep and meditative and where you can belong. As a young teenage girl, I wrote a poem called The Old House. And the opening lines were, upon a gently sloping hill, an old house somber stood, quivering with each gust of wind that shook its weathered wood, and so on. But the last line of the poem, which is really interesting to me, particularly as I've experienced this wonderful old house in Yankala, and as I myself have grown older, someday, my young body, an old house will it be, with nothing but my spirit to tell the world of me.
Well, I always ask the fun questions, you know. The basic question really that I'm always interested in is, how did you get interested in genealogy?
Well, I got started as a child with my grandmother telling me stories, and that was just sparked my interest at the very beginning of my life. And then when my grandmother died, I found a trunk full of letters. So of course I had to find out who were the people in the letters.
Right.
So basically my research started once I had those letters in hand.
Right.
It's amazing how we have such similar stories, because for both of us, it was a grandparent as well that just kind of whet our appetite with those wonderful stories. Yeah. We're trying to encourage people to start looking into their own stories, their own family histories. What are some of the obvious places they can look?
You know, that's a funny thing, because my mother died recently, and as I found those materials, those genealogical materials, which is what I was very interested in, not just that, but all sorts of things, I found them everywhere.
Yeah.
For example?
For example, of course, in drawers. My mother kept things in odd places, though. I found when I opened a drawer that she'd taped something to the bottom of a drawer. It was a document that I guess she wanted to know where it was, and she had taped it to the bottom.
That was her safe place.
That was her safe place.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are all places, you just cannot leave anything unturned. You have to look in for jewelry and socks. I mean, my mother had some of her jewelry in a sock. I mean,
Really?
Yeah. I found a pocket watch and several other things to keep it from getting, I guess, scraped. She kept it in a sock. I found the recipe box.
Do you want me to hand that to you?
Surprises. One is not expecting always to find just, well, one doesn't know, you don't know what you're going to find.
Right.
I would not think of a recipe box as a source of family history information. I mean, that would be
Absolutely.
my first reaction to something like that.
Well, what happened was, when I went through the recipe box, I was going through, and again, these are not the way to store it. We'll talk later about how to store things. In it was a card in which my mother was called the past matron of the Eastern Star. So this was her, apparently, I guess, her dues card. So unexpected places, one finds bits and pieces of someone's life.
That's
I was just going to mention something like a report card. I thought I had found it.
I don't know if you'd want people looking at your
I
report
wouldn't want them
cards.
looking at my report card, but thinking in terms of even that's a source of information.
Well, my grandmother's sister's report card, and certainly my grandmother's report card.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did find that. I found money under the sink. I mean,
Really?
It's probably, then, what I'm hearing, a good safe assumption that everything's important. When we start looking, when we start going on this trail, if we see an attic, we should think that everything in that attic is going to have some possible significance for us, and not think that it's going to be just.
But she didn't
one
say
item.
just attic. She said right in the kitchen and the drawers,
Yeah, but we
right?
shouldn't-
everywhere,
Yeah.
and whatever you happen to find. I mean, I found genealogical materials in my father's car.
Really?
Because he brought them with him when he went to Texas. He died in Texas, and they were in his car.
So what did you find in his car?
I found a photograph. I found his barber's license. He'd been a barber. I found letters, photographs, the same
Right.
sorts of things.
Right. What's the most common thing that we should look for? The easiest things, the most obvious things that we should look for?
Certainly you start with yourself. I find that when you start with yourself, you can use yourself as a measurement. For example, you have a birth certificate. If you're married, you have a marriage certificate. Graduations from schools, for college degrees, you have all these things that you know that those documents have tracked your life. So the same thing is true for all ancestors and all of our family members. Everybody leaves a paper trail. So what we're looking for at home are all those materials that you have lying around your house, or stored or hidden or somewhere in your house that will give you information that you can use either on your pedigree chart, or you can use for individual information as by way of history of what someone did in their lifetime. For me, what someone did in their lifetime is what I find really interesting. So that's what you also find at home.
Another object that a lot of families, now it's very, very common back east, I'm not sure about in the West, but there were family Bibles that used to be passed down from generation to generation. Is that
Yes.
anything you've had any experience with?
The thing I have found interesting about family Bibles is that someone recently showed me their family Bible, or showed me things that were in the Bible. All the family secrets are often stored in the Bible. Those stories that no one wants to tell are the newspaper article that was written about, Uncle George. That was not to be mentioned, are often stored in the family Bible.
Right.
One thing that comes to my mind too is we're dealing with some stuff that really does have some value. We have to be concerned with preserving it and making sure that we don't inadvertently destroy it. Do you have any thoughts on little quick tips on preserving some of this wonderful material?
Yes, don't do what I've done.
I think we
we've
could
all
say
done.
the same thing, so we know where you're coming from.
And also some of the things that I found in my mother's house were not well preserved, but they were careful. For example, I found them in the cedar chest. The scrapbook was in the cedar chest. The certificate, the graduation diploma was in somewhere in my mother's house. And I had no idea what it was. I just
Sure.
didn't know what it was until I opened it. And things should never be folded
Okay.
or put
Or
in
rolled.
rolled into tubes as this is. They should be in acid-free boxes, and go to professionals to ask, how do you do that?
Right.
That's the best way to get answers, because the people who can give you the answers and sell the materials can at the same time give you a container,
Right.
for example, a box to put your recipes in or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah, and I know one thing that we found, we started making photocopies of a lot of the documents that we found, rather than always working with the original.
Oh, never work with
Because,
the
well,
original.
soon, it didn't take long. You find a brittle piece of paper and you're fascinated by it, but all of a sudden it starts flaking away, and it's not good to handle that frequently.
Right.
So one thing we'd like people to know is that there's another tool that they want to be familiar with, and we call it the family group sheet or the family group record. We have a blank one here, and I'm going someplace with this. So I'm not setting you up. I just want you to know I am going someplace with this. But when we look at a blank family group record, there's certain information that they're calling for. Now, on our pedigree, we're just looking at that direct lineage. What's nice about the family group record is that we start to see that, sure, your grandmother had brothers and sisters, and where do they fit? Well, they don't fit in your direct line, but they certainly are an important part of your family, and that's where the family group record comes in. How do you use the family group sheet? I mean, it's fairly obvious, but if you'd run through it for us.
Well, what's important about it is that you have a place for the parents, the husband's name, and the wife's name. Underneath this, there's a place to record information about each child in order of birth. This is helpful because not all of the children of a family will be listed on a pedigree chart.
And we see it's asking, here are the events that are common to most of our ancestors: born, married, died. The date would be written with the day of the month first, the month, and then the year in full, and the place would include the city, the county or parish, and state. And we do have a wealth of information that we're recording on here.
So see where it says sources? That's one thing I didn't do when I was starting my genealogy. So when we had to verify something for someone, if we're sharing our information, we didn't know where we got the information, so we're much better at that now, at documenting our sources on the family group
Yes.
sheets.
In fact, where did this information come from?
It came from a document that I had in my home. This information becomes really valuable when you start to do research outside of your home. If you can get this information in your home, that's a great basis, because
Right.
you'll then take this information and be able to identify, yes, this is the John Jones that I'm looking for, or the Henry Smith. Because the children, you know who the children are, especially if it's one of your ancestors, like your grandmother or something that you really know.
In my case, just to throw this in, I descended from 4 consecutive Josiah Willards, no middle name, and the only way of really historically telling them apart is to have a different family group record for each one with their children. Even though each one had one child named Josiah, they had other children as well, and that's really a way of differentiating.
And where there are blanks, that's what research is about.
Right.
That's what your research is for. You're going to try to find the details that would fill in this chart as much as you possibly can. Now, some people are really interested in just doing their pedigree charts
Right.
and their family history charts and their family history group sheets. That's very, very important, so that you know what the sequences
everybody
and how
fits.
people
Yes.
fit in. But in addition to that, finding all these little pieces to go together with that is going to make the difference. And
It's going to
so-
make it fun, too. And
Oh, much.
Yeah.
That's the best part. That's the best part. Knowing what people did, who they were,
Right.
how their life, what was
Yeah.
significant about their lives. So that when someone's just beginning, I think you just start with what you find. You don't know what you're going to find.
Right.
But don't overlook anything.
And don't dismiss anything.
Don't
That's-
dismiss
'cause
anything.
It might come
Yeah,
back.
right.
This has been fantastic, Antonia. Thank you so very much for
Great.
sharing your knowledge with
Great
us. We
fun.
appreciate it so much.
it's been fun. I can't wait to go home and start looking for more.
Some more, that's right. Thank you, thank you. Antonia and Shannon have shown us what a treasure house of family history exists all around us.
As you begin looking, keep in mind the following 4 tips. First, start your search at home.
Second, don't overlook anything.
Third, handle original documents with care.
And finally, write down the information you find on your pedigree chart and family group records. Your local library, historical, or genealogical society can help you get started. You may also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
You're watching PBS.
Today on Ancestors.
And what was the most shocking thing to me was to see Mom and Dad all of a sudden in a Buddhist temple praying and playing this gong. I had never seen them do anything like that in my entire life. That all of a sudden, I too was some of that.
You have to be a good listener. And often we're not trained anymore to be good listeners. Everyone wants to be a star today.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Author Alex Haley once said, "When an old person dies, it's like a library burning." We'll talk today with a family journalist about how important it is to record your family stories now before they're gone forever.
But first, let's meet Fabiana Chu, whose passion for oral history has led her from New York's Chinatown to Peru and back to her homeland of China.
When I was walking around in Chinatown earlier, and I was reminded of how comfortable I feel here in Chinatown. In my life, I have lived in many different places where I not always fit in. My history is a little bit complicated because while I am here in the United States, and my family is also here in the United States, we have immigrated to this country. Our origins go all the way to China, but then there was a stopover that lasted a few generations, and the stopover was Peru. And it wasn't only until I came here when people started asking me about who I was. How come I was from Peru and I looked Chinese? How come I spoke Spanish and not Chinese, etc.? And so all of these questions kind of in many ways confronted me and found me a little bit at a loss. And one of those days I was going about telling the same story. This time it seems that the right person was listening to it. And he said, well, you know what? This is very important and I want to hear more about it, and I think you should do oral histories with your family. And so that really became the turning point for me. Somebody who actually said, what I'm hearing is very important. You have to do something with it. Not just tell it, but tell it for others. Tell it to help others understand that they also have valuable stories, that those stories have to be told, that those stories have to be recaptured, salvaged, because if we don't do that and we don't do more of that work, all of those stories are going to disappear. So packed our bags, Mom and Dad, left from Atlanta. I met them in Miami, and we ended up in Lima, Peru. Not long after that, we went back home to set up a number of interviews with them and with other family members around the dining table or in the living room so that we could capture more of this personal story. Coming from a family of photographers, I have tons and tons of photographs of family members that I've never met. My father collected every piece of paper that came his way and every photograph. Through that, a lot of the history was already collected. Dad had said that he had lived downtown Lima in a very old building and that he lived with his entire family in just out of one-room apartment. But he always told me about this sanctuary that was at the top of the building. And they led me through this dark corridor, up a couple of flights to the wide open roof of a sanctuary. And this was a Buddhist sanctuary. And what was the most shocking thing to me was to see Mom and Dad all of a sudden in a Buddhist temple praying and bowing and playing this gong. What was so very interesting about that is that I had never seen them do anything like that in my entire life. And all of a sudden, it kind of something made a connection in my head. Something clicked. That all of a sudden, I too was some of that. I too could have a connection with that Chinese history and that Chinese tradition. When we were scavenging through our stuff at home in Peru, and we found this little book with about 10 pages worth of Chinese handwriting in it. And we realized soon enough, that it had been written by my great-grandfather. And then when I finally brought it back to New York, because I couldn't have anybody who could translate it for me in Peru, people haven't kept up with the language there as well as they have been able to here, the shock was to see what my great-grandfather had written. And it starts out by saying, "This book is written to you, my third daughter," which would have been my grandmother. And this book is so that you know who you are, where your family is from, where the ancestral village is, and who your ancestors are. So for me to know that back in the turn of the century, there's this man who cares deep enough about who he is and his family is to write this for his Peruvian-born daughter so that she would know, was absolutely astonishing to me. But no, all of this obviously had to do with history, had to do with making sure that this child that was born not to the old country would know exactly how to retrace her steps back. So interestingly enough, many generations later, it might just be the clue that I needed to help me retrace those steps back. And it traces me back so far that it actually helps me determine that I am the 23rd generation in my family. Perhaps one of the things that was really useful to me is interviewing my parents and my aunt and asking them about the documents they might have had, the letters that they might have still. There's something that I learned that helps me make more of an emotional connection with China than the actual factual information. I found this one letter from an aunt. Her name is Chiu Kum Lin. And this is an aunt that I had never met. It's a great aunt. She wrote this letter to my father. "The photos you sent were taken quite a long time ago, and their colors are blurred and fading. I hope you can send me some more recent ones so that I can look at them as if we met." And she wrote this in the 1960s. And that was probably one of the last letters that we received from them. And I'm not sure that we answered this letter either. But what this tells me is how much she cares about us, how much she cared about us and the photos and the people that she had never met, and how I care about her, even though I had never met her either. One of the things that I've been very fortunate with is that I come from a family of photographers, a family that always not only documented the community, but documented every moment of family history, joys, pleasures, etc., in a way to capture their happiness and their times together. And I'm convinced that there is a family out there that were the recipient to all of these photographs that were taken over many, many generations. I know that when my family in Peru was setting up those pictures with that tripod and posing, I know that those pictures were being taken to be sent back to China. And I know because they were looking very good, very regal, very progressive, and in the back, they actually were really poor. They didn't have more than a 5th grade education. One of the things that I expect to find and that will tell me everything is okay is if I go back and I find a place where all of those pictures are kept. And I know that things would be okay. If there's one thing that I know I've gotten out of it, is less details and more of a sense of this history and what this means. If I were to summarize it all, I would say it has to do with how hard the family worked, how poor we were, what their struggles were, and how through it all, our family kept our heads straight, our chin up. These stories are not really appreciated. These are the types of things that you don't want to hear about because it kind of places you in a time when you were not doing too well. But for me, I kind of get a sense of pride from all of this. Kind of get a sense of, I gotta work hard because they work hard, because they broke their backs for me. I better make their time worthwhile. And I kind of get the same sense about the future. I kind of feel like I'm both doing it for the past and for the future. I'm very lucky for having been able to have the chance to talk with Mom and Dad before they forgot it all about all of these memories. When I have children, I want them to know how sweet their grandparents are. I don't know whether they'll get to meet them, but I want them to know how special and how loving their ancestors were, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents, and those who came before them, and that all of this history is actually a treasure that is being given to them. And so a lot of these oral histories, especially the ones with Mom and Dad, have been collected in many ways, not only to give me a sense of who I am, but more than anything, I think, to give the next generation, including my niece now, and my nieces and nephews in Peru, who it is that we are. And the questions will keep coming back, and people will always ask them, so who are you, and what are you all about? And I think that if I give them these tools, they'll be able to feel that there is more to it than their own generation. And that with this renewed sense of history, of collective history, they'll be able to go ahead even stronger. Give them that sense, that loving sense, give them a sense that people before them, even though they didn't know them, loved them. Because I know there was a lot of love in our family.
We've introduced people to the pedigree chart, and now we're at a point where we want to start fleshing that out, adding information. And what a wonderful way to do that by interviewing your older family members.
What I'm really interested in is to know how you got interested in oral biographies with a journalistic background.
Well, it's an interesting thing. It just didn't happen. I guess I've been a working journalist all my life, and it was at a time in my life when I was recovering from a sickness, and my newspaper had almost gone bankrupt, so it had been a difficult time, and I was starting to be aware of my own sense of mortality. And I went away for a short period of time with my family, my wife and daughter, to Martha's Vineyard, an island off Massachusetts. And when we go away, we take a tape recorder with us and cassettes, and we went to the local library to borrow some cassettes, and among them was one that was unidentified. And I was wondering, what was this mystery tape? Well, it turned out to be a wonderful tape of young children on the island interviewing people in a nursing home who had lived on the island for 80, even 90 years, and the kids were asking people about their stories, about what life was like. And I thought, that's a wonderful idea. I'm a journalist. Why don't I try to write a book to teach families how to become family journalists? I had taught young people how to become regular journalists. And the goal was for families to set up spoken oral history libraries of cassettes that they could play the way you would play cassettes of music. Only in this case, you would hear
Listen to your
family
relatives,
stories.
Sure.
Who would be the best person to start with?
It seems almost every family has sort of a keeper of the flame, the family history flame. They remember all the stories, and they love to talk, and I would start with trying to find the oldest person in the family. Hopefully they're near you someplace that you can see. The reaction you'll often get from relatives when you talk to them is, why do you want to tape my story?
Yeah.
I'm not a movie
Right.
star. I'm not a very important person. I haven't accomplished that much in life. You have to try to convince them, and I think you have to really believe this deeply, that their story is very important to you. I say in this book that everyone has a story to tell, if only someone would listen, if only someone would ask. And the story is this. This is how I cope with my life. This is what I learned in my life. And we need to share that information.
Is it a good idea to have a list of questions? I think you alluded to that. but
Yes.
so that doesn't kind of break the flow as long as you've...
I think that's sort of organizing yourself and organizing your material, whether it's the time period that you want to investigate or a part of the family you want to know more about.
Is there a particular type of question that might be better than others? I mean...
Yes. Journalists generally ask closed-end questions and open-ended questions. In your closed-end questions, you're trying to get a 1 or 2 word answer, a date, what year were you born, what year did our family come. And that's important for the history and filling out the pedigree and all that. But the best part is the open-ended questions. That's where you get values, you get the content, you get feelings, you get shared knowledge. An example would be a closed-end question to some extent. What's your full name?
Right.
Person tells you their full name. The more open-ended questions, what does your name mean? Do you know?
Yeah.
Or do you know whom you were named after? That's very important. Or if they have a nickname, who gave you that nickname?
Yeah.
Or what did you do to deserve that nickname? What mischief?
Yeah.
You also, as a family journalist, you have to be prepared yourself. Make sure you bring with you a pencil and paper, note cards, pad. Make sure your tape recorder is working. I can't tell you how many senior executives I interviewed. I forgot to put either the tape in, or the batteries didn't work, something went wrong. So that's part of your preparation as well.
One thing that I picked up on, and I'm thinking in terms of my own paternal grandmother, she would have been intimidated if I had walked in with a tape recorder. It would have been, you know, once it got started, she probably would have just, you know, how can I get around that?
Sure.
Or, how could I? I really wish I had.
That's a common problem, and it's solvable. It's new technology, but it's new technology to do something old. If our ancestors, great ancestors, used to sit around a fire and tell stories to each other, and they'd pass it down from generation to generation. Instead of sitting around a fire, you're sitting around a table, but you have this machine, and the machine is just a tool to help you. I usually show the person this instrument. It's not so frightening. I fumble around with it. I show how it's made up, and I put the cassette in. I might even record my own voice so they can hear that it doesn't bite. And then I'll just put it to the side of the table. It'll pick up the sound. I might even put a book in front of it so people start becoming, it doesn't hit you right in the face. I think people get used to it, you know, when they finally leave them alone with it.
Well, you could do the same thing with a video camera. You could set it up where you could see her, but it wouldn't be...
Definitely. But don't you shoot don't shoot her in the terms of you being the person handling the video recorder. Get a third person, whoever it is, maybe your son or daughter or someone else in the family. But I would try to minimize the obtrusiveness of the technology. It's very important that you stay focused with a person and engage in a conversation. You know, interviewing is very simple in many ways. It's just having a conversation with another person in which maybe you do a little bit more work, you're asking more questions, you're trying to cover the who, what, when, where, and how, as any family journalist will do. But even more important, you have to be a good listener. And often we're not trained anymore to be good listeners. Everyone wants to be a star today. So we have to sort of put our own egos inside ourselves a little bit more, listen better.
Right. What if I wanted to go interview my grandmother tomorrow? How would I get going?
Give me some tips.
Well, first of all, don't interview your grandmother tomorrow. Whatever you do, don't do it tomorrow. Do it another week or two, because it's important you both have some time to think and reflect about your time together when you're going to do the oral or video history. I think that's very important. Your grandmother can prepare a little bit. First of all, you have to tell her why you want to do this thing. That, Grandma, this is so important to our family. I want to capture our family story, our family history, and you're a very key part of this process because you remember so many of the things that I don't know and that generations from now don't know, so please help me in this. I'd like to maybe talk to you about a period of time, maybe the Great Depression, or maybe World War II or World War I, depending what your interest. Maybe you even want to know from your grandmother, where was she the day JFK was assassinated, to bring it to more contemporary times.
Kind of pins them down at a place
Yes,
and
they can
time.
start focusing their thoughts. And then you say, Grandmother, could you also gather some family materials to help us in our meeting? For example, how about a map? It'd be nice if you have a map of the old country where our family came from. Or Grandmother, how about some great family photos that show you in your old-fashioned dress? And,
Well, she probably wouldn't think it was so bad.
Right? Maybe some immigration papers, old passports.
Do you find that sometimes older people are also afraid to tell you something that they don't want to tell you, that, you know, a family secrets or something like that? Is there a way to make the older person you're interviewing feel comfortable that that's not what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think you're not looking after scandal. You're not running a bad tabloid here, for example. We're trying to understand our family better. And each family has good stories and bad stories and sad stories. If you really want to, if the person is totally uncomfortable with a particular story she's about to tell you, I guess you could take the tape recorder off for that period of time. You can give them the option. You might take notes instead so that you could remember it yourself and that perhaps you can then speak into a tape recorder later and say that I was told this story, and you don't necessarily have to identify who told you that story. But I would try to respect the person's wishes as much as possible. Another very important thing is don't do the family interview in one session. It doesn't work that way. One thing I don't like is I get calls sometimes from people. They said, please send me your book because someone in my family is dying. They're on their deathbed and I have to tape their life story. I mean, there's something macabre, humorous about it, but something sad about it. You don't want to do it that way. You want to do it as part of your life process to make it pleasurable for as long a period as you have. Also, people want to save things, you know. They want to see, are you really interested in my story? Are you going to come visit me again? Right? How many times our parents or grandparents say, I never see you. So here, they have a sort of a control over you that you're going to come. And that's kind of good. It gives them power because the oral history process is a process of empowerment. You're telling the person that what you have to say has value to me. I want to hear you. How many of us want our story to be heard? How many of us want to tell our stories, but hardly anyone asks us anymore?
Bill, we've covered some wonderful ground today. Can you summarize for us what you see are the most important points for somebody as they're ready to start this process of interviewing their older family members?
I think, number one, try to be enthused about the project because you're off to an adventure, and I think it's really important that you want to do it. Don't do it just because you feel you have to do it. I think the next step is to think about what you want to accomplish. Try to organize yourself to some extent in the sense of what are your goals? Is there a certain thing you want to learn, you want to bring out of these interviews? Organize yourself, too, in terms of preparing questions, and even much more important, preparing the person to help them have a better interview, and by that, encouraging them to gather the materials to help them recollect and to remember. Thank the person most sincerely for what they gave to you, and always keep in mind that everyone has a story worth telling. If only someone would listen, if only someone would ask.
I think what's come out of it for me, and I hope you'll agree with this, genealogy as a hobby, family history, can be very interactive. It's not just sitting in a dusty room, and
it's fun.
It makes it come alive. Bill, thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your being
Thank
here today.
you for sharing.
Thank you so much.
Bill and Fabiana have shown us that the most important family history resource we have is our own living relatives.
Before you start interviewing, keep in mind the following 3 tips.
First, prepare your questions in advance.
Second, check to make sure your recording equipment is working properly.
And third, record your family's stories now, before it's too late.
Your local library, historical, or genealogical society can help you get started. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
You're watching PBS.
Today on Ancestors.
During the Holocaust, they took individuals, people, each one with their own soul, and they wrote numbers on their arms. The job of a genealogist is to take people who are just numbers and give them back their names.
What is a record?
The record is our tangible link to our ancestors, because the record really is nothing more than a written account of a very important life event.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Most of your ancestors left a paper trail. Today, we'll visit with 2 genealogists who will show us how much information you can discover about your ancestors from the records they left behind.
But first, let's go to Ellis Island and meet Raphael Guber, who discovered how to make the records of his own family story come alive.
America was like a big candy store. You had all these people coming from this poverty and deprivation, and Europe meant all kinds of strictures and bonds and class systems. They wanted to come in here and make it on their merit. The only problem is we came here and we were so successful in getting lost that we truly, collectively, as individual ethnic groups, became lost in America. We suffered a kind of spiritual indigestion. After stuffing ourselves on the bounty of this country, a lot of the children and grandchildren finally said, you know, there's got to be more than candy. There has to be something that's more sustaining. My father had these beautiful memories, and I said to him one day, I said, Dad, you can't give your memories to your children. You got to give them the circumstances for them to create their own memories. And that yearning brought me to discover on an individual basis who my ancestors were. And Ellis Island is particularly attractive because it's a door through which we can pass into the experiences of our ancestors. Right before I went to visit Ellis, I had gone through a number of major changes in my life. I had just been physically ill. I went through a lot of pain for a good number of months before that. Also, I had been involved in some major undertakings in the real estate world. I had risen pretty high up, and when the market crashed, I kind of crashed with it. I will admit that I was one of those people who I guess my sense of self-esteem was tied to my accomplishments and my bank account. And it was just the perfect time for me to start wondering about who I was. And I guess I decided to start as far back as I could. I finally decided to go to Ellis Island. I made a point of going alone. I just felt this was kind of a quest. I had this idea that somehow riding on the ferry and passing the great lady in the harbor, the Statue of Liberty, I would be seeing the things that my aunts and uncles saw and that my grandparents saw, and maybe somehow I would be able to imagine myself being in their place. I just wanted so badly to learn about who these people were. My grandparents, with the exception of one, all died many years before I was born. And I asked someone on Ellis Island, how do I find out about my family, about their documents when they came in here? And finally, someone explained that I would have to go to one of the offices of the National Archive. I was just amazed. With a very short period of time and with a lot of help from the staff, I was able to find out incredible information about my family. In the case of my mother's side of the family, all we knew of was the name of one grandfather, and I found his passenger ship list. And it says that he was picked up by his father. Well, you know, after that I had gone and I found where he's buried, and I found his death certificate. I found the name of his father and his mother's maiden name. So I was already back to my great-great-grandparents' generation, back to 1835 without having to go to Europe. It was just amazing. The manifests contain information like the street addresses in Europe. It contains information like the names of relatives left behind, how much money the people had in their pockets when they arrived on Ellis Island, who came to pick them up, what their first address was. In general, there's 28 to 30 columns of information on each one of your relatives once you find them. And what also makes the documents incredibly fascinating is that even though they were written in English, they were actually written in Europe at the ports of embarkation. They're incredibly accurate because people didn't have a chance to forget those very close associations with the little towns they came from. A lot of times when you get involved with genealogy, people go, well, why do you do all this stuff? You do all this work and it gets stuck in a drawer. And I decided to try to create visual images out of the information that was contained in the document. I would first take the document itself and turn it into a visual image by transforming it from this gray-toned microfilm into the original red, white, and blue document, which we do on an aged paper. Then we look at what the document says. It says they were from a town like Berdichev, so we find the photographs of Berdichev. We took this old grainy photograph and we gave it life, the same way I wanted to give life to the people in the documents. The document also says the name where the people were going to be in America, their first address in America. And I found a photograph of the building and that street corner, and I turned it into a pen and ink work to also give it a kind of visual form, to make the whole thing into an image. Arthur Kurzweil, who's a very famous genealogist, said during the Holocaust, they took individuals, people, each one with their own soul, and they wrote numbers on their arms. They took away their names, and they turned them into numbers. The job of a genealogist is to take people who are just numbers and give them back their names. I can't think of anything that's more of a sacred trust, more of a emotional and beautiful experience than finding a name. My mother couldn't remember her grandmother's name. And in my document search, I was able to finally locate the name of my great-grandmother, Esther. And it was bothering my mother terribly, this woman who used to bake cookies for her and took care of her. And she kind of remembers her as being like 4'7" and just constantly walking around baking something and full of joy and warmth. And I found her name the day before Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. And I remember praying and feeling the spirit of my great-grandmother was with me because I was fortunate enough to give her back her name. And I suppose, in general, that was the problem that I had with a place like Ellis Island. It's geared to have thousands of people a day walk through, and there are exhibits and photographs. I guess maybe it was a little bit of Ellis Island under glass for me. I'm always dissatisfied. It's never enough for me. I wanna feel. As a result of that understanding, I decided that I had to supply the emotion. I had to dig and go the next additional steps to give life to these people who gave life to me by finding out who they were. We took 100 people who were members of UJA, United Jewish Appeal Federation, and we dressed them up like their immigrant ancestors, and we try to recreate the confusion and the uncertainty, the emotions that these people had experienced. Their grandparents and great-grandparents were being pushed and shoved, and were waiting to see whether or not they were good enough to be accepted in this country. We try to recreate the confusion and the uncertainty, the emotions that these people had experienced. And it hung on sometimes incredible circumstances, whether or not they would be allowed to stay or not. You know, I just imagine my father being 11 months old, having gone through this terrible voyage and having a colic, and, you know, people screaming at my grandmother, "Can't you shut that baby up?" And my aunt Anna practicing the 20 words of English that she wrote down so she could help my grandfather get through this process. And they were petrified that they were going to be sent back. And the emotion of that moment is something that I wanted people to feel.
Married or single?
Married.
Okay.
I remember her telling me it was just so frightening for her. She was a young girl, I don't know how old, I would say around 10 or 12. She felt at that moment, and maybe rightfully so, that the family's chances of making it through those big doors into this country were based on her ability to explain what this man dressed in a uniform was saying to her.
Your Uncle Mendel gets here, you can go with him to Brooklyn. You're fine.
I look at the names on this manifest of my relatives, and they laughed and they cried and they sang and they went to parties and they prayed and they were sick and they loved and they made babies and they died, and what do we know about them? I know that their lives were worth remembering. I'm proud of the fact that someday my grandchildren will know who my grandparents were. In 100 years from now, will anyone know who you are? And what little bits and pieces of your life would you want to save so that someone could maybe make it into a montage or a book of genealogy? What about you is worth remembering? And if you can't figure that out, and maybe it's time to think about changing your life. And that's why I find that the study of genealogy is an incredibly emotional experience. Something that it's not often given credit for. Genealogy is just really about who we are, and the willingness to look into our past, our collective past, says a lot about the willingness for each of us to look at who we are individually, to look in the mirror, figure out where we came from and where we want to go.
We're at a point now where we've been filling in our pedigree and gaps are starting to show up. We have to turn to records. And I think a lot of people are intimidated by records. I think that's a good way to put it.
Oh, but they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be
I
at
think
all.
if we just
no.
had a basic definition, just a
Yeah.
simple, what is a record?
The record is our tangible link to our ancestors because the record really is nothing more than a written account of a very important life event. Records pertain to when our ancestors got married, a record was made. When they were born or baptized. When an ancestor enlisted in the army, a record was made. Or when an ancestor came to America, there's a ship passenger list record. So when you're dealing with records, you are dealing with that link to your ancestor's life, and it's very, very exciting.
That's what I think too.
There's nothing that we have to be afraid of then.
No,
I mean, it's...
no, records, they're intimidating only because you haven't done it yet.
Right.
But once you get into it and do it, they're a lot of fun.
And what about compiled records? I mean, what are compiled records? We hear that a lot.
The compiled records are ones you're going to find in book form, where somebody has gone through a cemetery and copied down all the tombstones and put it in one volume, or somebody has gone through all the marriage records in a courthouse and put it in all one volume and compiled it. Or a compiled record might be a family history written by someone else. So that's what we talk about as compiled records. They're also known as secondary sources because they're created later, much later than the actual event occurred.
But the other side of the coin is the original record. Original records are sometimes called primary sources because they were created at the time of the event by an eyewitness, or close to the time of the event by someone who was an eyewitness. And that's why we call them primary sources or original documents. And they constitute the whole wealth of history. All the records, all the information about our ancestors is out there in archives and record repositories around the country and courthouses. That's what we go after, those written records of those important events in our ancestors' lives to go up the pedigree chart.
If I'm a beginning genealogist, which should I start with? Should I start with the compiled records or should I start with the original records?
Well, actually, you should start with a basic how-to book.
Okay.
A basic, good how-to book that will tell you how to find the compiled records, how to find the original records. Then from there, that will lead you into a library where you'll find the compiled records. And don't be afraid to talk to the librarian because he or she is going to be the one who will really guide you and point you into those compiled records. But the compiled records would be the first place to go.
Of course, the basic compiled record you'd want to look for first is to see whether or not someone has already published a history of your family.
Oh,
Depending on which branch you're researching, the first thing to do is to look. There are published bibliographies of family histories in the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. There's a 4-volume published bibliography of family histories in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So right in the reference section of your own library, you can get a good idea whether some distant cousin whom you've never met has already done much of the work for you. When you use compiled records, they generally will send you to the original. They will tell you what record repository to go to where the original records are so that you can get the basic information from in your library, and then you write a letter or you take a little trip and you get the original records to make sure you've got the right information.
Are there any disadvantages to using a compiled record?
Oh, that's for sure.
Compiled
records are
that was a
easy to
loaded
use.
question.
Yes, it was.
And a very good question, too, though, because it's important to keep in mind that compiled records are prepared by historians, genealogists, and archivists, librarians for research purposes. They can contain mistakes. They can contain errors. Compiled records only constitute also a small portion of the total number of records out there. When you're dealing with historical research and finding the lives of your ancestors, there's a huge world of records out there that by which we know history. Compiled, published records are really only a small portion of that.
So the word of caution that I'm hearing both of you say is that that's a great place to start. There's a lot of work that's already been done. It will save us a lot of time and effort, but we have to just verify what we find in those books.
We can't just pick an ancestor and say, that's my name,
No.
here's my
That would be
ancestor.
nice.
One of my experiences was running into a compiled family history, and it was from the original immigrant down 5 generations. I was here, I had only gone back 3 generations, and then it was like, uh-oh, what do I do in between? How do I kind of bridge that gap?
In genealogy, you always work from the known to the unknown. Always, you begin with what you know first, what's already on your pedigree chart, what you got from the attic and interviewing relatives, and then you reach into the unknown, beginning with compiled records, such as these in genealogies in your public library. But if you can't make the connection quite between the last bit of information on your pedigree chart, you've got a couple of generations before you can link into published or compiled records. That's where original records come into play, and they are the great fun of genealogy.
Have you run into any
I
unusual
brought
documents?
an example following one particular family with some documents.
Oh, that's interesting because it's the same family.
It's the same family in the records. This record here is a passenger arrival list. This is for my great-grandfather, Salvatore Abatino, when he came from Italy to America. He came first so he could earn enough money to send for his wife and children. And this type of record gives a wealth of information, unlike some of the really, really early passenger arrival lists. It tells me he was 30, he was married, his occupation. It tells me the town in Italy he came from, Terlizzi, where in America he was going to, Harrison, New York. That he paid for the passage himself. He didn't have to borrow the money. And it tells me that he was going to join his brother-in-law, Albino Di Bartolo, in America. So it gives a whole bunch of really neat information. Then when he got here, he decided he wanted to become a citizen. And so we have his Declaration of Intention record, as well as his petition for naturalization. And this record gives a little bit more information in that it names his wife, where she was born, her age, and all of his children and their birth dates. And it even shows us Isabella, who was their first child born in America, and sadly their first child that they lost in America. I have one other record here.
Let me interrupt. One thing that I find fascinating, it's got his height, his weight, his hair color, his a scar on his forehead.
Yes.
I mean, you get a physical description.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
That's kind of exciting if you don't have a picture.
Really, it is. And then when you do have a photograph, you think scar on the forehead. Now you're looking at that photograph a little bit more closely. Where's that scar?
And you can identify him from old family photos, maybe. I mean, there's a lot there. This may seem like a simple question, but was spelling ever a problem?
Oh,
I mean, we know.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Especially when we think of this man with an Italian accent. He didn't speak very much English. He spoke broken English. And someone's asking him questions, and he's saying it, and someone's trying to write it down from what they hear. So I have found the name Abatino spelled many, many different ways.
You will find errors. You'll find blatant mistakes sometimes in the older records. We have here a baptismal record. A young boy, an infant, was baptized in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1873. And we find not only the name of the infant is given here, his date of birth is given as February 30th, 1873. A little slip on the part of that priest that particular morning. We have the names of his parents, his father, his mother, the godparents are listed. And in the right-hand margin of this baptismal register, we find the priest has made a notation in Latin. This is the Catholic Church in Vicksburg, that the infant was baptized in private or at home, close to death. So this was a quick baptism before the child died, and of course that led me immediately to check a few days later in the burial records of this particular church, and sure enough, the little infant died the next day after being baptized. So that's one of the sad records that you can find. It also points out that when you find original records pertaining to your ancestors, they might contain happy news, sad news, or as you say.
Would you have any tips on when I start to use these kind of documents, these records, that I should keep in mind?
Well, definitely maintain the golden rule of genealogy, and that is always start with yourself and work backwards. Work from the known to the unknown. Don't skip over your parents or your grandparents and think you know everything about them. Collect those records on those people as well. But that's the basis, because if you try to start with an ancestor that you think you're related to and try to come forward in time, it just doesn't work. You're spinning your wheels.
What about specific to the use of compiled versus original records? Are there some tips I should keep in mind on that?
We said that the secondary sources, the compiled records, are easily accessible in your library. They're printed, they're indexed, they're easy to use. When you go out into record repositories, it's not always as simple a matter. There's a double challenge with using the old records. First of all, you have to find the records pertaining to your ancestors using the manuals we talked about and getting into the courthouses and the archives. But then once you have the record in front of you, you have to be able to decipher it. You have to be able to read. I'm sure the viewers have noticed all this old handwriting. We have handwriting here by an Italian purser for an Italian liner. We have handwriting of a census taker in Buffalo, New York in the 1860s. Here we have the handwriting of a court official. in the state of Kentucky, Caseyville, Kentucky, in the 1870s. Everybody's handwriting was different, and everybody's spelling was different.
But that's sort
So
of challenge.
that's the fun of it. That is the challenge of it. When you get the record pertaining to your ancestor, it's fun to decipher the handwriting to figure out exactly what it says. We also said that there are errors in secondary sources, but there can be errors in primary sources just as well.
Records are an essential part of genealogy. We basically have two kinds, compiled and original. It's always a good idea to start with yourself, work backwards in time. We've got to remember there are advantages and disadvantages to whatever records we may choose to use. Okay. Any words of wisdom? Anything that you can throw in that, you know, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Do it. It's great fun. It's great fun. It's a lot of fun to discover the facts about your ancestors' lives. You'll be surprised you never know what you're going to find until you do that research.
And it's addictive.
Yes.
Very addictive.
Sharon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank
John, we
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to
Very,
be with
very
you.
informative. We've learned today that you can find exciting and valuable information about your ancestors from the records they left behind.
Keep in mind the following 3 tips.
First, records are created because of important life events.
Second, there are basically 2 kinds of records, compiled records and original records.
Third, because someone may have already done much of the research for you, check compiled records first before looking for original records.
For more information about records, contact your local library, historical, or genealogical society. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
This is PBS.